Welcome back, everybody, to the Happy Cynics. We're going to delve a little bit into economics today and try to work our way through some of the misconceptions that seem to be out there. There seem to be a number of them that people tend to overstate. Like, let's say, if we start with, say, defining capitalism, socialism, communism, even just those three big ones. Those are the ones that we're all kind of familiar with. But would you prefer that we roll back a little further, Isaac, and maybe talk about where economies come from and what's the purpose of an economy?
Yeah, I think it would just be helpful to sort of recenter ourselves on what the purpose of the Deprogramming project is.
Yes.
And talk about the ways in which people have been programmed to think about their economic status and the way that the whole system sort of fits together.
Right. A lot of, when you hear a lot of rhetoric that's out there, it's a lot of straw man rhetoric. People claiming, this happens in political ads all the time. And I'm not just talking about where they mischaracterize somebody's positions because they wouldn't vote for a bill that had pork barrel terms in it or something like that. But even, for example, what does it mean when Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist? Would be one example. And what do we mean by free market capitalism? And so where would you like to start, Isaac?
Well, let's kick off with a little bit of a discussion about what the purpose of an economy is.
Yes.
So one of the bigger questions is the purpose of an economy to get the goods and services to the people who need them and have use for them, or is the purpose of an economy to sort of regulate social interaction?
Oh, okay.
Right, because that's kind of how, like, to me, that's how capitalists will use the economy of, well, capitalism is sort of set up such that it is not very well equipped to distribute goods and services in an efficient manner, but it is very good at defining class boundaries and keeping people sort of in their place.
Accumulating wealth, yes.
Yeah, it's very good at sort of accruing wealth to a certain class. It empowers
some citizens over others, if we could maybe say it that way. So when we think about the dawn of human civilizations, really, at the beginning, the first step was, okay, when you had tribes kind of doing their own thing, everybody just kind of taking care of themselves. Jack of all trades. You hunt for food, you raise a garden, you use the animal skins and such, or fibers to make yourself garments and things like that. Well, then when groups came together, they found it to be beneficial to diversify labor. Each person just do one thing, produce one type of good, and then everybody could exchange goods. So even, let's say, you have a town, one person is a leathersmith. Okay, so that person makes all the leather goods. You have one person that makes barrels. You have one person that raises horses, like a livery stable or something. Well, then people would trade. Okay, so really money was invented to make it unnecessary for people to swap goods and services. So if I were, say, a green bean farmer, so to speak, let's say my specialization is green beans. I don't think it was quite that specialized. Corn might be a good one. So let's say I raise corn. Well, then I'd go trade so much corn for if I wanted another horse. or I'd trade corn for something else. Well, we invented money to replace goods and services, so it's a means of exchange. That's what we mean by that term. So that's the point. Now, where Isaac's coming at, this is part of Karl Marx's criticism of capitalism. Okay, so here's the thing. Capitalism basically runs from investment. So you take money to invest in a business, and then the business makes more money. And so the difference here is the goal is not really to make sure everybody has a horse, everybody has a saddle, everybody has the shoes that they need. That's no longer the goal. The goal is, how much money can I get by selling my saddles? Okay. And can I make them more cheaply than somebody else, or make better quality saddles so that I can make as much money as possible?
Yeah.
So jump in there.
Part of capitalism, and I think capitalism is a good term to define at the start of this, because people think they know what capitalism means, but it's that line from The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
Okay. And maybe I'm in that category too. I'm not really sure. So
no, I don't think so, but I think a lot of people are. That capitalism, everything has to stem from capital, and capital is not just money, but private ownership of property.
The means of production.
The means of production, but also just like property in general.
Yes.
So that's what capital is. Capital is any property that you have a like paper deed ownership of. And it stems from a central organization, because that central organization enforces the ownership of property.
Okay. So let me now take a step back to put that into context a little more. So if we go back to the Middle Ages, Middle Ages was largely dominated by what we call feudalistic state. So you had the lords were the people that were the landowners, and basically all of the land was just owned by a few wealthy people. And anybody who wanted to support themselves, okay, you had to work for one of these landowners, and you work for them. You were a serf or a waif or whatever, okay? They would pay you basic wages and then give you a place to live. The only vestige we still have of this, as far as I know, in the West, would be in, say, religious clergy. Now, even a lot of religious organizations are moving away from this. So even if you remember, so those of you who are familiar with the Bible, you remember in the Hebrew scriptures, the Levites were going to be the ones who served as priests and temple workers, etc. So they didn't get land. Their inheritance was God. And then everybody was taxed to help support them. This is where the tithe comes from, okay? That is kind of the beginning, or let's put it this way, that is along the same lines as like the feudalistic state. The feudalistic state, you had several landowners, and then they became wealthy. Even as late as around the Reformation era. For example,
or even slightly before, you have the merchant class arise.
Right. For example, I don't know how many people are familiar with the story of Ignatius of Loyola. Before he started having his visions in the cave and all of that, he actually served in the military for some rich dude in Spain. Like, a lot of these landowners were so rich that they had their own soldiers. They had it was kind of like they had their own little kingdom, is the way it was. Well, when the West started becoming democratized, there were others. I'm most familiar with John Locke. I think there were others. I can't remember Montesquieu. I'm not sure exactly who said all what, but I do know, for instance, Locke said there should be 3 basic civil liberties. Rights, 3 basic rights of each person: life, liberty, ownership of property. Okay. Well, then the ownership of property, initially in the democratization, the idea was everybody could have a piece of land. And so we would spread the land out. Everybody would have their own little parcel or have their a piece of property. But with the development of capitalism, this allowed the accumulation of wealth and property, not necessarily, and sometimes it is land, like we were talking about how many acres George Washington owned at the founding of this country. I'm trying to think what it was, 50,000 acres or something.
Oh, I heard it was in the millions of acres.
Oh, maybe 50 million acres. I mean, it was, yeah, roughly.
It's an unthinkable amount of property.
Yeah, like maybe like the size, around the size of Ohio, or a state about that size. Because he had property, and he owned property in like 8 or 9 different states. But nevertheless, see, this has always been the struggle back and forth. Capitalism basically is a way that, okay, you take money, you invest it, you take capital, you take property, and then you invest this into production. And the Industrial Revolution is really what gave capitalism teeth it never had before. And this is what Marx was reacting to. Yeah. So here's the thing. Let's come back to the illustration of, say, the little town. Somebody's making the barrels, somebody's, a cobbler making shoes, there's somebody making dresses, whatever. Okay. Everybody's got their own little business. Okay. And we're using money. You can still have capitalism where you are taking capital, you're investing in your business. Maybe if you're a dressmaker, you buy a loom or something like that, a little labor saving device. Those sorts of things. But when they started inventing big machinery where things could be mass produced, then this is where the scales tipped, and people like Marx argued that this basically now has allowed like a continuation of the feudalistic state. Because, for example, if I'm the local barrel maker in my hometown, well, once the machinery comes available to crank out barrels by the hundreds, well, if I can't afford to buy that machinery or invest to be able to buy that machinery, I'm going to get run out of business by somebody who can afford to invest in that machinery.
Yeah, and it's a important note that like feudalism led into mercantilism, which is sort of just an extension of feudalism into capitalism. And then the people who were rich under the feudal system and the mercantilist system became the capitalists of the capitalist system. They were the ones with property to invest. So there is a direct line of inheritance of wealth from these older systems.
Yes. And then throw into that mix the institution of slavery. Then you have entire groups of people being enslaved and put to work in a feudalistic system where they didn't even have freedom. They weren't being paid any wages to spend. They weren't allowed to empower themselves in any way, like to get educated or anything like that. This is kind of like feudalism run amok, where the landowners, and this was the tension between the North and the South. The South was relying primarily on slave labor for its wealth, to generate the wealth among the aristocracy. And, there again, you have a bunch of common Southerners being conned into fighting and putting their lives on the line for the sake of the rich plantation owners. And, and that sort of pattern tends to replicate itself over time, because ever since the Industrial Revolution, now we have the ability to mass produce. Okay, it's going to be a very tip scale. Let me just shift this very quickly to something that I think people would understand a little more. Let's say professional baseball. Okay, if you go back in time before we had radio. Okay. I mean, we have the internet, we have instant access through satellites and everything. You go back a little ways, then you have television. Before satellites, television only came through cables or from antennas picking up local broadcasts, but it became more and more localized as you go backwards. If you go back before radio, well, where were the professional players making their money? By people what they paid for the tickets to see the games. And that's where all the money was made. So in the old days, before radio became a big thing, you had people like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Honus Wagner and all these people that weren't really being paid a whole lot. They weren't like super wealthy. They weren't like Rockefeller rich or anything like that. But now, here's the thing. And so you could have baseball leagues and teams all over, and there really wasn't a whole lot difference between what somebody was being paid on a more local, regional level or in the major leagues. Now, because everybody can watch whatever game they want, you can have a minor league team in your hometown, and chances are each of these players is probably being paid no more than about $50,000 a year or so, and they're having to go out and get other part-time work in the off season. Meanwhile, those that make it into the majors, because it is mass broadcast now, because you're able to give your product to a whole bunch of people now. That's what's changed everything. Okay. If it were down to where you could only give your product to maybe a couple thousand people or whatever, well, then you'd have a whole bunch of smaller stores and in every aspect of economics, of business, say, it ends up being where whoever's the cream of the crop, they get to sell to everybody. So it's like, if everybody can listen to their favorite singer or watch their favorite athlete, okay, watch their favorite movie star or actor or actress, whatever, well then, why are you going to fool with watching the people who you don't prefer quite as much, who may be at the B or C level?
I mean, why to go to your local theater when you can see Hamilton on Disney Plus?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so here's the thing.
Well, I think this baseball metaphor is particularly useful because it's not a metaphor; it's an example.
Yes.
The real winners are not the baseball players, even though they strike it rich. The real winners are those who own the broadcast networks.
Right.
And the people who own the teams. Those are the people who really benefit from, the contracts to, if you want to film in my stadium that I own, then you're going to make me rich doing it. And, I own the infrastructure for broadcasting this around the world. And so I'm going to make a ton of money off of these players' product. Now, what's crucial about defining capitalism is, so that's capital. Those are the people who own the capital. They don't labor in producing the product, but they accrue the largest portion of the value of the product. So
Right,
the players,
right.
while they might be very wealthy, will never be a capitalist.
Right.
Unless they take that wealth and, like people like Shaquille O'Neal now own a bunch of companies.
Right.
Well, then they can enter the new class of capitalism.
Right.
But while you are working
yes.
for capitalists, you can never cross that bridge. And so I think one of the main misconceptions about how capitalism works is that capitalism has all this social mobility in it. That, everyone has a chance of being rich, when that is just patently false. The odds of us becoming rich off of working through the capitalist system it's like winning the lottery.
Well, okay, yes. So you basically have to become the owner of some sort of business that you can figure out how to successfully market it at either a very high cost and get people to pay that, or at a more marginal price. And what I mean by high cost, like you can either sell it at a high price, is what I mean. You can sell it at a high price, or if you're selling it for less, then you got to sell a whole bunch of them. But everything's controlled by the owner. That's really what capitalism is about. And everybody else is going to be subject to the requirements of the owner. Now, this is where in the early 20th century, and even say the Vatican, Catholic Church, other organizations, even Marx, they were helping to form unions. Okay, before, people tried to do the whole thing with the Russian Revolution and everything. But the idea was for people to band together to be able to have some kind of leverage against the owner. So if the owners push too hard, then the owner would have to start from scratch with a brand new labor force. That was the only leverage that the workers had against the owner. And so that's why unions were a big part of the backbone of blue-collar America when America was more prosperous. This is what I find a little bit, I'll say interesting. Okay. Some of the people that think if I vote for my candidate, we're going to go back to some great golden age, but a golden age that, I'll just come out and say it. I mean, it's not Biden. Biden's got his own issues, but say Trump, okay? Is Trump really a big pro-union person? I mean,
I'm pretty sure he's on record as being very anti-union, actually.
Yes. So, at some level, I think people are kidding themselves about how much are you going to get from a particular candidate. And that's across the board. But here's the thing. Everybody has at least the freedom to try, but to try to make it big, well, then you have to take financial risks. And so for each person that makes it, there are others who fall flat on their faces and end up broke. And so that's the thing with the capitalist system. Now, this is all part and why it used to be, I know maybe about 30, 40 years ago, there was a lot more discussion about inheritance taxes and things like that. That, raises the question because, and I don't want to get us off track. I'll just kind of bracket this and then we'll come back and move on. But I just want to mention this while I'm thinking about it. But this whole thing of you have to be an owner, like the owner has the advantage. The question is, how much of that advantage should a parent be able to hand off to his or her children? Okay? Because if everything runs based on a person's ability to invest, well then, on one hand, you'd say, well, it's fair if I made this money and I give it to my kids and I give them a better advantage. But if we start talking like hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, where basically my kids don't ever have to work their way up through any kind of ranks or whatever, they just step right out at the top with all this money to invest in capital, all this capital to invest in business. And I mean, is that really the same kind of start that most people get in life? Like, the question is, if somebody does hit it big, how is it? You can say it's only fair that I can hand it off to my kids, but other people say it's not fair if you hand all that off to your kids based on the way our economy works. It's not that I don't think people, and see, this is the thing. It's not, at least there may be some people that say this, but the real argument, it's not really about whether somebody inherits enough money they can go on 3 vacations and own 3 houses. That's really not the main thing. It really has to do with whether somebody has leverage over other people because they have more money to invest in businesses, to start up and stop businesses, because those are the kind of things that are the lifeline, the lifeblood of average citizens. They need these businesses to be operating to be able to support themselves. Right. And the question, so go ahead.
So the other sort of aspect of capitalism that is not necessarily inherent to it, but is inherent to it in its expression today, is the global economy that capitalism has sort of created for itself.
Right.
And the rise of fiat currency. I think these two things would be important to just sort of cover quickly.
Go ahead.
I'll start with fiat currency is currency that only has value because a central organization says it has value, right? So the global economy is run off of the American dollar, and the American dollar is based on nothing other than the word of the American government.
Yeah. And so go ahead.
So the environment that creates for capitalism is one where there's this perception of value being disconnected from material goods. So the amount of money available in an economy or somebody's wealth is disconnected from material, like real things, real value in commodities.
Right. So talk about that in terms of, say, when Nixon took the United States off. Well, the Nixon administration, they took the United States off of the gold standard.
Yeah. So the gold standard acted as a way of like saying, so every dollar represents a certain amount of weight in gold. And that gold is based on how much gold is stored in Fort Knox.
Right.
Which acts as a ceiling to how much the entire economy can be valued.
Right.
Without that ceiling, the economy's value can go potentially infinitely. But the thing that is like the problem with that is there is no such thing as like abstract non-material value.
And basically our currency is almost like a promissory note.
Yeah, and it creates an incentive to infinite growth, right? So you measure how well a country's economy is doing by its gross domestic product.
Right.
Which is just how much products it has produced in that year. And on a
I'm
fiat,
laughing because Archie Bunker said the United States has the grossest domestic national product. Anyway, go ahead.
So there's this like great lie that, well, we can just grow infinitely.
Right.
You know, we won't ever have an economic problem because we can just keep growing and growing.
We'll just keep growing money.
Which is essentially a Ponzi scheme. That's how a Ponzi scheme works, right? Well, I'll take your money and give it to the last investor, and I'll take the next guy's money and give it to the last investor. And as long as I can do that infinitely, then everything's okay. It's that you can't do that infinitely. And where you pay for that at the end is in how you've mistreated your environmental resources. right? So we end up just sucking the earth dry of any sort of material value, which we might need in the future in pursuit of this like perpetual growth. And that is exacerbated by the globalization of capitalism. Because businesses are no longer national businesses. They are now international, and therefore capitalism must be protected on an international level.
Right. Right. And that's why even the, current and former communist countries, so like Russia and China, they're having to become more capitalist to be able to trade and to be in business with the Western world.
Yeah, I would be careful about ever calling them communist because...
Well, traditionally, I'm thinking...
I mean, the USSR is,
Mao Zedong
in its name, socialist, but...
Yes, right.
There have never been communist countries. There have been communist places, but all of these like major Marxist revolutions have only ever produced socialism. And we can talk about the differences between those two.
Yeah, because there was a shift in how the word socialism was used before and after the communist revolution of 1917 in Russia.
Yeah, the Red Scare did some numbers on our understanding of these terms.
Right, and that's part of the confusion today. Some people still use the terms in the original way it was used, and others use the terms in ways it started to get changed. I'll give you another illustration of this kind of dynamic. The same thing happened with conservative Christians in the United States calling themselves evangelicals. Because this is why I think LGBTQ is kind of a repeat of the evolution, the Scopes trial, 100 years ago. We're getting close to the 100th anniversary. That was 1925, as I recall. I wasn't alive then, but as I recall reading.
Oh, you weren't?
No, I don't have that much longevity. But so anyway, the term, what happened was after the Scopes trial, there was a group of conservatives. They were part of broader evangelical, but did not want to be called fundamentalist. And so they used the term evangelical to say, we are not fundamentalist. But after Jerry Falwell revived that term in the 1970s, and then the term fundamentalist got kind of dragged through the mud from the 80s forward, like with all religion, any kind of extremism was called fundamentalism. Well, then none of the Christians wanted to call themselves fundamentalist anymore. And so now when somebody says I'm an evangelical, now maybe some of that's sifting itself back out again. I don't know. The question is, am I a fundamentalist or not a fundamentalist? And, anyway, the same thing's kind of true with socialism. So coming back to this. So socialism. So let's go ahead and tease that out a little bit, Isaac. On.
So
yeah,
to understand socialism, you do have to understand communism because they both fall out of Marx's interpretation of capitalism, right? And to very quickly boil that down, his interpretation of capitalism is that in capitalism, in the marketplace, any commodity can receive its fair value, right? So there's this thing, the use value of a coat is keeping you warm when it's cold outside. The market value is whatever that value is projected onto money. Mm-hmm. And they're normally not the same. Normally there's a winner and a loser in that transaction, but sometimes they can be the same. That's true across the board. All of that can be fair, except for one commodity, which can never, ever be a fair exchange. And that commodity is labor. So in capitalism, because you work as a laborer, and anybody who's a laborer is a member of the proletariat, the proletariat must work for a capitalist who owns the means by which they do their labor or the means of production. Right. So they own the tools, they own the machines, they own whatever it is that you need to make a living, they own it.
Right.
And because of that, they appropriate some of the value of your labor for their ownership.
Right.
They've done nothing.
They're purchasing your time.
Yes, but they're also appropriating. So like back in feudal times, if you were a member of the merchant class and you didn't have a feudal lord, you're a blacksmith, you sell a horseshoe, you accrue the full value of that horseshoe. Or even if you do have a feudal lord, you accrue the full value of that horseshoe and then pay a portion of that value in taxes.
Right.
But you are the direct appropriator of the value of your labor.
Right. It's your horseshoe.
Whereas in capitalism, you make the horseshoe, it's not your horseshoe.
Right.
You get paid a wage to make the horseshoe. And that wage can never, ever be worth the value of the horseshoe.
Right.
Because otherwise, the capitalist doesn't make his money.
Right.
So, kind of as a result of that analysis, Marx looks forward and says, well, the proletariat's not going to tolerate this forever. And so there will be a revolution that brings about a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the government centrally plans the economy for the fair distribution of commodities, and that government will be run exclusively by members of the working class, so non-capital owning people.
Right.
However, there is still a marketplace. There is still, all these things still exist, but certain commodities are taken out of that marketplace. And if you work for a company, there is no owner of the factory. The workers collectively own the factory. Right. So that's what socialism is supposed to be. Now, socialism in history has a more brutal, bloody background to it, and generally devolves back into capitalism. It's just capitalism of the state, which is just feudalism again. I mean, that's what we see in China. There are private businesses in China. There are owners of the means of production in China, but they're all controlled by the state.
Right. Yeah.
So that's not socialism.
Yeah, not in a full-blown sense. So I know some of the popular usage of the terms kind of evolved to make a distinction between, as far as I know, some of the difference, like Europe and, say, Russia, the Soviet bloc, would be the shared ownership was actually through the government. It really, to my knowledge, there's never really been the actual Marxism where everybody has owned all the business together. It's supposed to be owned through the government, but then what happens is the elected leaders, who then often protect themselves from having to leave office or face another election, or if they do, they work some way to rig it so that they are voted in as many times as they want to be. Okay. But it ends up being owned by the government. And so basically the way it kind of worked, like a lot of Europe did not want just, say, unfettered capitalism in their economies because of the disparity of wealth that's has been produced since the Industrial Revolution. And this has only become even more so the case now that we have computer technology, because who can afford to, have the best technology? Okay. The best machinery, the best technology, the best robotics or whatever. So you have all that dynamic as well. So a lot of the European countries would refer to themselves as socialist in the sense that, okay, well, the government is not going to own anything. We're still going to have private ownership and private enterprise, but the government is going to set limits on, say, how much money people can make from their business, how much CEOs can be paid. They'll set some of them will set like wage caps. We have minimum wage here in the United States and other places, and there's a reason. There's a reason for that.
Yeah,
we don't want to go back to people working for pennies a day in sweatshop conditions.
The proper term for like how European countries sort of express Marxist values is social democracy, which is different than democratic socialism. And those are two separate things, and they're very minute in their differences. But social democracy is one in which the devolving of capitalism into a state where workers cannot tolerate the misappropriation of their labor is avoided. So things like housing are provided for, healthcare is provided for.
Right.
Your basic needs are always going to be met, whether you are employed or not. And the accruement of wealth into the hands of the few is limited through taxes. So there's always a very high tax to pay in these countries, but the amount of services the general citizen receives from those taxes is more efficient than the market could ever work out. So like a great example of this is Vienna, where I think it's over 80% of the population lives in social housing, which we would think of as like a Cabrini Green or, some horrible place like that, the way we've worked that out in our country. But in Vienna, these places are beautiful, well-maintained apartments and houses. And the majority of the population opts to live in socially owned housing.
Right.
Because that's how the government has kind of worked out how to provide housing for people. Now, there is a private housing market, but its effect on the value of housing in the controlled market is so limited that it's negligible.
Right. And I guess the trade-off of that in Vienna is you have a good place to live, but your sausages are really small. I don't know who ever come up with the name Vienna sausages. Well, maybe somebody at Armour, but I mean,
the real trade-off of it is if you live in social housing, your housing, you don't pay very much for it. It's very affordable. Right. Everybody has housing, but you don't get to appropriate that value and pass it on to your kids. Right. So you can't pass a huge amount of property onto your kids. So you don't become super wealthy off of your housing.
Right. I'm not trying to wrap this up too quickly, but just kind of as a little stopgap here. So let's just say this. The bottom line is that capitalism produces wealth, but now since we have the ability to mass produce and mass market and even mass deliver goods and sometimes even services. So think about big tech companies that they can offer their services to people around the world, okay, through the technology we have. Because of that, capitalism produces wealth, but now it has the potential to create wealth very unevenly, where people at the bottom really struggle to even, because here's the thing, the more money, so this is another part of the problem. The government keeps spending money, and then when we need more money to spend, they just print more money. And then all this does is keep devaluing the dollar because there's only so many goods and services out there, and we keep creating more money.
Right.
More
this is part of the
cash.
Trap of infinite growth.
Right. There's only so many goods and services out there, and if you just keep producing more money, then each one of those, the prices go up and the value of the dollar goes down. And so it just keeps going.
This is a little bit of like a microcosm of this issue, but in America, one of the ways that our politicians keep people from voting for more social services and protections from the government. So we don't have nationalized health care. We don't have housing benefits. We don't have free education. Part of the way that these politicians get people to say like, oh, well, we can't have that because it's too expensive is by saying like, well, we'll have to raise taxes in order to give you this. And that's probably true, but it rests on this fundamental understanding of taxes as the thing that funds government services. And that's not how government services get funded, at least at the federal level, right? Because the government can print its own money at any time. So if a contractor comes to them and says, we're going to build you a jet and it's going to cost $3 trillion, the government has $3 trillion because the government prints money. What taxes do for the federal government is pull money out of circulation. So when the government needs money, it prints money and then taxes people to limit the amount of inflation that takes place because of the printing of new money. Taxes do not fund services. They only pull currency out of circulation.
Right. Yeah, it's not like, I mean, we can tell by the deficits we have in the national debt that the politicians aren't, the elected officials. The elected officials are not limited to only spending what money we send in or whatever. It, like Isaac's saying, it's just that money comes out. That's money we can't spend. So it's pulled out of circulation. So that's that much, we have that much less money we can spend on goods and services. That helps to counterbalance the fact that they want to keep spending more and to try to keep everything in an equilibrium.
And a lot of what they spend their money on is propping up capitalism.
Right. Oh, right. Even like the fact that a number of businesses, like, so there are certain things, say food, the food industry, the government has to subsidize a certain number of businesses. See, here's the thing. So rather than put controls and say, this is how we've chosen to do, or our leaders have chosen to do this. So if somebody's making too much money selling food, because after all, everybody needs food and everybody gets hungry, and everybody knows we Americans eat more than we need to anyway, on average. Okay. Now Isaac's a good weight. I'm overweight, so I'm one of these people. The thing is, there's a lot of money to be made selling food, but instead of saying, okay, I mean, now some of this, let's say this, there's so many aspects of the economy, it really is difficult to regulate. And that's why that's ends up being the fear. People are saying, well, if government regulates it, then government has to regulate something else, because people always find loopholes of ways of recapturing the profits that they lost. So if you say, for example, okay, McDonald's, you have to start paying your workers $20 an hour. Okay, well, McDonald's is going to find a way to make the profits again. Probably what happens is the price of everything goes up. Everybody's now paying $15 for a meal, just a sandwich, fries, and drink at McDonald's instead of the $8 or $9 that it is now. They get their profit back. Okay, but so what I want to say is, if regulating is difficult unless you're going to unless the government regulates different aspects of the economy. And here in America, we're afraid of doing that. So instead of doing that, and I have kind of mixed feelings, and this is kind of, maybe I'm getting to the edge of my knowledge and expertise on this, and maybe sometime we could do it a little deeper dive. But instead of regulating and say, okay, you can only pay your CEOs this amount and this is what you're allowed to do. You can only charge so much for a cheeseburger or whatever. We'll don't do, or let's say we want to make sure that, say, food stays affordable. Everybody can afford to buy bread and cheese and whatever. Well, then the government ends up pouring more money into competitors to try to keep the prices from getting too high too quickly so that everybody can still afford to get a dozen eggs.
Of course, there's whole lobbies built up around trying to accrue those government subsidies, especially like in the energy sector. Coal and gas are non-profitable at this point because renewable energy has caught up to them. They only exist because the government props them up. Right.
And so that's the thing. We avoid government control, but instead of doing that, so instead of the government stepping in and saying you can get rich, but only so rich, we say, oh no, we don't want the government doing that. And then what happens is they basically just spread the gap between the average person and the rich that much further or farther.
Right.
Okay. And that's what I think a lot of average people really don't think about. It's, and then everybody gets scared into thinking that, gee, if we don't let these people be uber wealthy, then they're going to take away our jobs. I mean, at some point, okay, for example, I'll come back to baseball. All right. I'll use that as an illustration again. Let's say baseball is going to be regulated and the government says, okay, you can only charge so much for a ticket. You can only charge so much for let's say NFL Sunday ticket or whatever. Let's say the NFL, whatever. You can only pay players up to this much. I've heard people say, well, if the government if the government starts regulating businesses, then the quality is going to go down because people are going to drop out. Well, I mean, truthfully, say if a baseball player is no longer making $50 million a year, is he really going to drop out if he's only making $30 million a year? I mean, really? I mean, there's certain businesses that are so profitable. It's just kind of hard to think that somehow we've just got to let it keep getting higher and higher and higher and higher, or we're not going to have it anymore. People are just being scared into buying that. There are businesses where that sort of thing can happen. And if you try to clamp down too much, well, then people are like, okay, you just can't make money in it anymore. Look at, there's not a shortage of doctors, but there's a shortage of nurses. And why is that? Because of the pay.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know how I feel about increasing government regulation in the economy, because I, like Marx, thinks that capitalism tends to eat itself. After the pandemic, you had all these businesses complaining about not being able to find workers, and these businesses are offering like $3 an hour plus tip. Like, yeah, I wonder why you can't find anybody to work that, because if you let it keep going, these businesses, at least the small businesses here, went out of business. They just said, well, we can't find anybody to work for the wage we want to pay them, and the wage we want to pay them sucks. And so they just went out of business. Which, good. Get out of the economy if you're not going to pay people fairly. I have no sympathy for it. But when the government tends to step in is to, at least in my experience here in America, the government just tends to pick winners. The banks are too big to fail.
Right. Yeah.
And to me, by letting the government pick winners just because, their friend is the CEO, that nullifies the ability for smaller groups of people to band together and find their own success.
Yes.
So, and this is part of what I wanted to get to, is that I don't think America has to be capitalist, and I don't think anything necessarily has to fundamentally change about our country for us to adopt other economic paradigms.
Okay, so what would you like to see? So go ahead. I'm all ears here.
Yeah, I think it would be good before we get down this rabbit hole just to define one last term, which is communism, and what communism is. So
it's godless atheism, I think.
It has something to do with that. Yeah. No, all communism is defined as is a classless, stateless, moneyless society.
Right.
So if you want to know if something is communist, you got to ask yourself, well, are there classes in that society? And if the answer is yes, then not communism. Is there a state? Is there a central government? If the answer is yes, not communism. Is there paper money? Is there any type of money? Well, then it's not communism. Because communism is those three things. That's all I would define it as.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would, and this is maybe this isn't accurate to say it this way, but I would just call that pure communism. What usually gets called communism is a form of like socialism, like government control of the business and things like that. And I'm not advocating, no, don't get me wrong. I think in the vast majority of cases, okay, so we're talking about fast food. All right. Nobody has to eat a cheeseburger. There's all kinds of things we can eat. That's really not a necessity. I mean, we do have to have some kind of food to eat that's affordable. So at some level, the government does have to get involved either through subsidies or controls or something to make sure that everybody can still get bread, water, cheese, milk, whatever it is that we need to eat, vegetables, fruits. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
the other area I would say is important. That really you can't just leave it. Here's the thing. I think there are two areas where you really can't trust the economy to self-correct itself necessarily. The one is just in basic food prices, and the second is in healthcare. Because you take anything else, nobody has to have internet, nobody has to have a cell phone, to survive. I mean, you don't have to have any of these things. So if you can't afford it or don't want to pay that, you can buy a cheaper one or do without. It's just like if I don't want to pay what they're asking for an automobile, then I can just take the bus or I can walk, whatever. The point is, but when you start getting into somebody's health, and especially now, again, there's a difference between, I want to have a couple moles or warts removed versus I've got some kind of cancer that may metastasize and spread through my body. Well, then that's a different. When you start getting into life and death situations, like and basic quality of life, does somebody have shelter, clothing, food, and good health? This is where I think we as a society need to kind of step back and say, okay, when it comes to these basics, okay, and I don't want to get ahead. I'll just kind of throw this out and then we'll move on. I don't want to necessarily discuss this, but here it is. I mean, we'll talk about, I think there needs to be some kind of welfare, but I do think that people that are able to contribute some sort of labor to get that welfare should do that. That could be another episode. But I'm more of like an FDR welfare liberal person than I am, say, a a Johnson era welfare person. I think just handing people money doesn't really always achieve. It doesn't always help people to be mobile and improve themselves, and they're not giving anything back for what they get if they're able to. But that can be another discussion. But here's the thing. So in capitalism, I'm just going to say I think there needs to be some kind of intervention, at least in some of these basic areas, because, I mean, really, do we really want prescription drugs being priced based on who can afford to stay alive or whatever, who can afford to buy those things? Okay, that's my little 2 cents.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to shut up.
I want to get a little bit on that.
You can comment on that and then go ahead and move into your other economic paradigms.
So those,
I mean, you're not going to talk about Bitcoin or something, are you?
No. Yeah, no, I'm not into crypto. But when it comes to those marketplaces that you mentioned, housing, food, shelter, health.
Right.
They're not really proper marketplaces in this sort of like libertarian sense of capitalism, because you can't choose not to participate. Right. You can choose not to participate in any market. If you want to be
a dead homeless person, I guess.
But you can't be a dead homeless. The role of the government is primarily in the protection of personal rights. And the most fundamental personal rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in our country. And so life, you got to have housing, you got to have food. You have to.
Right.
So the government should protect your right to life in some way by preventing people from depriving you of that through their own wealth.
Yes, I think everybody should have a means of access.
Yes.
To those things. Yes.
In terms of liberty, you can't choose, because you can't choose not to participate in these marketplaces. Your liberty is being infringed on in some way. You have to play this game by these people's rules. And that, I think, is an infringement on the right to liberty. Pursuit of happiness is maybe a little bit more abstract, but that's why those particular commodities, I think, get special treatment, because the way the system works now violates some of our fundamental rights.
Okay. I'm not sure how I would respond to that. I think I get your point. I have to think about that a little more.
I mean, you can't choose.
That might be a little stronger than the way I would word it, but I'll think about that.
If you want to live, you can't choose not to buy insulin.
Well, yeah, that's true.
You know?
So let's say this. The way it's structured for a certain number of people, it violates their basic rights. I would agree with that. And now, then,
but in order to protect the rights of the few, you have to, across the board, remove this marketplace for everybody, or it's unfair and it's unjust.
Or you do the other. There is the other area where, again, if the government doesn't want to regulate, then it has to subsidize. So if the government doesn't want to say, hey, you can only charge so much for insulin, then the other option is you let market forces determine how much insulin costs, and then people that can't afford it, you just give them the money to go buy insulin.
I would not prefer that solution.
I think there's more problem with that second option, which is what we do. I think it would just be easier for the government to regulate the production of insulin,
or just pay for everybody's insulin on its own terms. I mean,
that'd be full regulation, and basically it would just be one of the things that the government does.
Yeah.
I mean, we do. Okay.
Every other developed country in the world does this.
I'm sure somebody out there listening, and it's not that we have a huge audience, but I'm sure somebody's probably thinking, oh, these guys sound like a couple of communists. What we're even talking about here is just basically we already have, say, certain things are already funded by public monies, by governments. So like roadways, highways, bridges, civic buildings,
infrastructure,
different thing. Right. Basic infrastructure. All we're saying is that certain things like healthcare and other things, perhaps we should consider
as public infrastructure.
Those, right.
It's the basic needs for society to function.
Right. It's the infrastructure of people's lives is really what it is, instead of just their communities.
Well, but just as much as transportation is.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, yes. The government provides there. That's a great example. So if you can afford it and you can buy your own vehicle, you can have your own transportation, whatever. But if you can't, then the government is going to make sure there's something affordable that can get you from place to place. You may have to wait longer. It may take you longer to get there because it's got to make all these stops and other stuff, but it's there and you can function. And it's got to at least, it wouldn't really be that out of place to structure other things that way as well. Things that are more central to a person's quality of life, basic quality of life. Things that a lot of us take for granted. But anybody that has a retiree in your family, and the biggest fear of everybody today in retirement is, am I going to be able to afford health care? That is horrible. I mean, and even like we have so many veterans that have to basically, petition Washington to be able to get the health care that they need. That's just unconscionable. I mean, are we really that selfish and greedy? We can't, well, anyway, and now I'm getting on a soapbox. I'm sorry. So what other ideas do you have here about other possible directions?
At least here in America, I know this is true because I've seen it, but I'm sure this is true in lots of places, that certain businesses can operate under different economic models than capitalism. So there are businesses organized in America under socialist principles and under communist principles. And those businesses are fairly large and fairly successful. The one that I am most familiar with, because I belong as a member to it, is REI Co-op, where the entire business is employee and member owned. So if you're a member, you own part of the business. There's no stocks. There's no public investment. It's all, members and employees only.
What is REI?
REI is recreational equipment. Or let me look it up. It's an outdoor store, so you can buy backpacks and shoes, and it's like a Dick's Sporting Goods, but more like outdoor co-op Dick's focused. Sporting Goods. Yeah,
co-op sports store.
You can buy like kayaks there store. And climbing shoes and stuff like that.
Neat.
Ropes. So I shop there all the time because I am an avid backpacker. I go every year. And they have the equipment that I need. So I'm a member. Being a member is great because you get discounts and all sorts of stuff. But I also get to...
Do you watch the movie Deliverance before you go on your trips to kind of get yourself revved up?
Sometimes, actually, yes. It is kind of like that. I've got tons of stories I could tell about backpacking, but I will refrain right now. The point is, as a member, I get to shop there and I get special discounts and I can, other things like that. But also, I get to vote on issues affecting the company.
Oh, okay.
And there is no one owner of the company. All profits, now you have to be an employee for this, but all profits are shared amongst the employees.
Okay.
So that's not capitalism because there's no capital being invested there. everyone owns the capital collectively.
Huh.
And so they have shared interest in making the business run profitably. Well,
Okay,
that's a clear example of here's a socialist business. There's nothing to stop a group of people from organizing their collective resources and doing that themselves.
Right. Okay. The obvious question here is, okay, that can work well for individual businesses. What would happen if all businesses were run this way? Would that work? Or does this only work because we still have the other structure that supports it?
I don't see any reason why every business couldn't be run this way.
Yeah, me either. I mean, the only thing I think it kind of prevents is somebody becoming uber wealthy.
Oh, no.
For everybody else.
The one fundamental evil that's crushing our society, it prevents that? Oh, man.
Yeah, so well, anyway. Oh, all right. Was there another one that you wanted to do, or was that the one you really wanted to discuss?
Well, I just think there's a lot of my point is that there's no fundamental antagonism between the United States government and the structures of our economy changing. And that's not like some big scary, the government takes over everything. No, this can happen organically at a smaller level in community. Get together with your friends, brew some beer, sell it, and then split the profits between all of you. It doesn't have to be.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. Yes, it would be better if people just kind of, learn to cooperate with each other without government involvement.
That's why it's called a co-op.
Yeah,
because it's a cooperative business.
Right. There was one place we lived in Kentucky where I think the utility company, the electric company, was actually a co-op, and so we were part of the co-op for a little while there while we were living there.
A lot of towns have local grocery stores that are co-ops.
Yes. Yeah, that's another good example. Yeah, that is a great example. Yeah, some of these kind of tight-knit communities tend to be run that way too. So
yeah, well, there's there's another one that people will know is what's that? It's an orange juice brand that's really famous. That's a farmer co-op. So the farmers all own this brand of orange juice and control all the distribution and everything through this jointly owned company, but they all appropriate the profits based on their produce. Like Florida's Natural, I think it is, or something like that.
Yes, I've heard of that. And I know Hugh Jackman has coffee.
Yeah, he's got a fair trade coffee company, which is kind of like a co-op, but because it's organized internationally, it's a little bit different. Right.
And it's let's see, what is it? I get that, and then I can't remember the name of it. Laughing Man. Yeah, that's right. Not that we're trying to plug for particular products here, but that's another example of one of those efforts. So
yeah, I'm not part of what my point is there doesn't have to be a violent revolution, and I don't think violent revolutions are all that productive, honestly. This can just happen.
Yeah. All right. So when people here talk about socialism or socialist ideas, what do you think people assume when they hear that, and what do you think? I mean, whether it's, say, somebody like a Bernie Sanders or somebody else, that's the one that pops.
I think a lot of times when people hear socialism, they just think, oh, that's when the government does stuff I don't like.
Well, we're really big on personal freedom, and because we're big on personal freedom, we tend to be big on keeping the government out of stuff.
I've even seen people online say like, oh, the government bailed out this huge business. That's socialism. Like, it's just pure capitalism.
Yeah, I've heard that too. They thought it's corporate socialism or
corporations are the most socialistic thing I can think of.
Yeah.
I'm being sarcastic.
Everybody shares the wealth evenly. Yeah, that's not true. But anyway, anything else you think I think we did it. We went around the horn there. Any other topics that we need to kind of clarify here?
I mean, we could talk about different examples and illustrations through history, I think, until our teeth fall out.
Probably. Yeah. But I think we've kind of gone around these different terms and kind of teased them out a little bit. I hope you find this informative. Reach out to us, Happy Cynics, the Happy Cynics @gmail.com. And again, tell a friend about our podcast. I'm going to start making a little bit of a marketing push here, try to get our name out there, pick up some new listeners. But we do appreciate those of you loyal listeners who've been with us and keep supporting us. And anyway, we hope you have a great day wherever you're at. Hope you're warm and healthy and safe. Take care, and we'll be back again next week.